Hello everyone and welcome back to Misconceptions in History, and today we are looking at my favorite bomber of all time, the B-25 Mitchell. Now this medium bomber was actually the most produced medium bomber for the United States during World War II, and it was the third most produced bomber overall by the United States. And while not as famous as the B-17 or the B-29, it cemented its place in history with the Doolittle raid and its continued service during World War II and beyond. So let's go ahead and look at how the B-25 got its start. Now, the B-25 directly comes from the North American NA-40, which was a prototype bomber developed by North American Aviation. Interestingly enough, this aircraft actually first flew in January of 1939, and it was in March of 1939 that the Army Air Corps actually called for proposals for a new type of medium bomber. And actually, North America wanted to submit this aircraft for that purpose. However, nobody actually wanted to order the early prototype back at the beginning of the year, so they decided they needed to redesign the NA-40 into a new aircraft. Now, this new upgraded NA-40 was actually the NA-62 and would eventually become the B-25. Now, as for its name comes from this man, Billy Mitchell. Now, the irony being that an aircraft is named after Mitchell after he was basically forced out of the military for getting mad at the Army and the Navy for focusing on ships instead of aircraft in the 1920s, and he was completely right about everything he talked about. Now, unlike a lot of aircraft at the time that had to go through a lot of developmental changes, the B-25 didn't really have to go through a lot of development changes on design. It's actually a pretty good solid design coming from the NA-40, with the only real big change is they actually had to do a slight variation to the wings to give them a slight lift to help with stability issues. Beyond that, the aircraft design was solid. Because of this, by 1941, the B-25 was in full production, with the A and B series models going into service with the now United States Army Air Force. But it would gain its global fame on April 18, 1942, with the Doolittle raid. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this event, essentially this was a raid by the United States involving 16 B-25s launched off the deck of the USS Hornet, and they attacked 5 cities in Japan. And the attack actually didn't do any strategic damage to Japan. What it was a psychological damage. It showed the vulnerability of Japan, that the United States could strike back immediately, and it was an extreme moral boost to the United States at the time. From there, the B-25 would see service in the Middle East, Italy, Europe, the Pan-Pacific region, and it showed its value not only as a bomber but as an attack aircraft. In fact, one of my particularly favorite models of the B-25, which is the J model, was essentially a gunship version. The J models could carry between 14 and 18 machine guns and were designed to strafe enemy positions and ships. And the G and H models had a 75mm cannon on them to pack an even better punch. Additionally, the aircraft became very famous for usage of what was known as skip bombing, which is kind of what it sounds like. They would actually fly in very level, low to the water, drop a bomb at just the right angle so that it would skip across the surface and then hit a ship on its side. Additionally, there was one major upgraded version of the B-25 known as the North American XB-28 Dragon, and this was a high-altitude bomber developed strictly off of the B-25's airframe. However, the effectiveness of the B-25 at lower altitude actually negated the need for it, and they abandoned it after 2 prototypes. Now, the United States wasn't the only user of the B-25 during World War II. They were actually used by the Royal Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Dutch Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, the Chinese Air Force, and Brazilian Air Force all received them during World War II. And Brazil was actually the last country to use the B-25, having them as part of their inventory well into the 1970s. After World War II, they served in multiple roles around the world. They did see some usage with the U.S. Air Force for a few years as a multi-engine training aircraft, and were even a part of the Nigerian Civil War in 1967. They saw usage with more than 18 different countries after the war, in places like the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and would continue to see a role in the civilian world. Typically anything from like a transport aircraft. They were actually very common in the 50s and 60s for use for recreational skydiving as that became popular. There's even a famous disaster, the 1967 Lake Erie skydiving disaster involving a B-25. Today there's more than 100 B-25s still surviving around the world. About 45 of them are still kept in airworthy condition, including the ones I've shown you today. Now, the particular B-25 I'm showing off right here is actually located at the Lone Star Flight Museum at Ellington Airport, formerly Ellington Field, how I grew up knowing it as, in Houston, Texas. And I really recommend, if you're in the area, go visit them. They have a wonderful selection in addition to the B-25. So there you have it, a quick overview of the B-25, an aircraft made famous by a single event in history, really. And overall, it just served as a very good, very reliable aircraft that, because of its reliability, would see service into the 1970s across multiple nations around the world. So, that's it for today. I thank you for joining me. I look forward to talking to you all the next time.